Be able. I'm wondering if there's another volume. Yeah.
All right, everybody, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the third round of the Wisconsin Institute for Citizenship and Civil Dialogue series, better known as WICIT. Here today we have Dr. Jonathan Murphy. He's an assistant professor of economics at Nicholas State University, and he's going to talk to you today about expert failure. And it's going to be a great talk because John's actually won an award for this research. He got the Eleanor Ostrom Prize, which is an award given to the best paper published in the Journal of Institutional Economics. It's named after the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in economics. So let's give John an especially warm welcome.
Thank you very much. First, let me say thanks to Dr. Beatty for inviting me, and thanks to WICIT for sponsoring this event. Nicholas State University is down in Louisiana, right on the Gulf of Mexico, a little town called Thibodaux. Today is Mardi Gras, big old parties down here, but I say this with absolute honesty, I'd rather be down here or up here, given this talk and the snowy weather than down there, partying it up where it's 80 degrees, but thunderstorms. So thank you very much for hosting me. I am Dr. John Murphy, Nicholas State University. I also have an affiliation with Syracuse University, which I feel obligated to mention because most of this research did take place up there in the other frozen tundra. So the question that we're going to be asking ourselves, the question that we're studying is, why do bad policies come about? And more importantly, why do they persist? Shouldn't we, once we recognize a policy is not achieving its goal, move to get rid of the policy? In fact, seems to make sense, right? Something's working bad. We all recognize that it's not working. Why does it stick around? Well, there are a couple of schools of thought. One, the public choice school of thought, which you may or may not have heard of in your studies here. The public choice school of thought is using the method of economics to explore how political decisions are made. And one of the arguments about why bad policies stick around is that there are dispersed costs meaning the costs are spread out over many people, and they tend to be small and concentrated benefits. A small group benefits a whole lot. That small group that benefits a lot tends to lobby together, tends to put a lot of the pressure, keep these policies in place, even if they're making everybody worse off. In Austrian economics, the field of thought founded by Friedrich von Hayek and Ludwig von Mises talk a lot about the knowledge problem. The idea that so much of the knowledge needed to make policy decisions are dispersed, are tacit, are ephemeral. They don't exist in a way that's easily collected and analyzed quickly. So bad policies can stick around, can come about simply because we don't have the knowledge. And these are important explanations. These are very important explanations. However, my field of research, which I do with Roger Koppel up at Syracuse University, we raise an objection. We raise an objection, and we want to point out that information is scarce. Information is scarce, just like all of economics. The economic problem is, how do we deal with scarce resources? Information is one of them. And in particular, we rely heavily on experts. We rely heavily on experts. Experts are those whom we pay for an opinion, who help us make decisions in our lives. Your faculty members are experts. You are paying them to tap into their economics, their business knowledge, to help you become more productive members of society, to help you achieve your goals of learning econ or business, whatever it is you are studying. We rely on doctors for medical advice. We rely on mechanics for automobile advice. We rely on pilots. We rely on experts all the time. And experts, we have to make a choice. What information am I going to provide you? Your professors have 15 weeks with you. That's it. Maybe more if you're an econ major. You might get a couple of classes with a professor, but we have 15 weeks. We have to make choices about what information we are going to present to you and how we're going to present it. Consequently, a lot of stuff ends up on the cutting room floor. I teach principles of micro, I teach principles of macro. When I'm preparing my classes, we do not go over all the schools of thought that are out there, and there's a lot of them. We as experts make choices. We as experts make choices. So the study of research, the field of research that we call expert failure or information choice economics looks to kind of close this gap and help explain where some of these bad policies come from and where they persist. We are looking at the market for expert opinion. Looking at the market for expert opinion. By that I mean we are defining the expert as one who is paid for their opinion. We're not doing it by whether they have a PhD or even a degree in the subject. They don't have to. The only defining characteristic of an expert here is they are paid for an opinion. That's it. Usually that is tied up with a degree, but not always. You turn on the news, you will see lots of talking heads talking about many things that they have no degree in. Trust me, I listen to econ news, and there are very few economists on the econ news. But they are still experts by our definition here. They can be charlatans. They can be fraudsters. Nothing about this definition limits us in any way other than they're getting paid. The reason why we use this definition, it helps us use the tools of economics to study this particular market. It also frees us up from some of the arguments where things get bogged down in trying to define an expert by their expertise rather than what it is they're actually saying. That does nobody any good. This definition comes from Roger Koppel, professor of finance up at Syracuse University. Great 2018 book he has called Expert Failure. When we talk about expert failure here, it is very much akin to market failure. Market failure, hopefully you remember from your principles of econ classes, market failure is when the outcome of the market deviates from some optimal. The market doesn't do what it is supposed to do, allocate resources to their highest and most valued uses. Expert failure is akin to that. Here we have the expert's opinion, the advice the expert gives for whatever reason does not achieve the goal it's intended for. You go to your doctor and you say, doctor, I want to lose some weight. He or she gives you some advice. Whether or not that advice, if that advice does not allow you to lose weight, we would consider that expert failure. Related to this, related to the idea that we all have our specializations in knowledge. Again, from your principal's days, surely you remember specialization and gains from trade. When we all specialize in things and then trade for things where we're relatively unproductive, it increases the knowledge, or it increases the product in the society. Division of knowledge is the same way. This university has all sorts of divisions, colleges of business, of education, of sciences, all that. We all specialize in our own things. And through those gains from trade, Dr. Beatty can specialize in economics, spend all of his time, or the vast majority of his time learning economics, and convey that to you, while your professors of biology, of chemistry, of mathematics can study their fields and convey that to you. Consequently, we all end up in our own silos. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but too much specialization can actually move us in the opposite direction. Adam Smith, the first economist, I should say the first one to systematically study economics, in his 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations, he's the one who first pointed out the benefits of specialization, but he also goes on to say, he gives us a warning that if we specialize too much, that can actually lead to a certain torpor of the mind. In other words, we become dull, boring, and idiots. In fact, that's one of his arguments for general education, for having the state sponsor education for everybody, so that we don't become too specialized. This over-specialization is going to be an issue. It's one of the factors that leads to expert failure, as we'll talk about. And in particular, experts, when they become too siloed, too specialized, can have difficulty in interpreting data. Economists are often accused, sometimes justifiably, of having a kind of warped idea of what a human is. We have Homo economicus, the highly rational, self-interested maximizer. That is all they are doing. They are constantly trying to figure out how to maximize. They are profit seekers. But of course, we all know nobody acts that way. If they did, they would be asocial. You don't want to be around somebody who only sees you as a means to an end. We're very social creatures. And so sometimes, not always, sometimes economists can have trouble interpreting information that seems to run counter to our models. We call it irrational behavior. We see this all the time in all sorts of different professions. Because of these issues, because of over-specialization, we can have what I have come to call cascading failures, where fairly small decisions, fairly small mistakes in advice end up having very large outsized effects. This model is very, very similar. Maybe you've heard in money and banking. I don't know, Dr. Beatty, do you talk about this too big to fail? The too big to fail argument. So I know this predates a lot of people in this room, but in the 2008 financial crisis, bless you, there was a concern that our financial systems and our automobile manufacturers were too big to fail. In other words, if they collapsed, they would take everything down with them. They were systematically important. Cascading failure is similar, where a failure in one sector can lead to mass failures in other sectors. What I'm going to be talking about today is what are the institutions, what are the situations that bring that unhappy result to bear. So I want you to imagine a lake. You live right next to a big one, really big one. Take a rock, go out to the middle of Lake Superior, you drop it in the middle. Big rock, small rock, small rock, doesn't matter. You drop that rock into the middle of the lake, what happens? What happens to the rippers? Think you drop a rock in the middle of Lake Superior, are we gonna have tidal waves on our shores here? No, in fact, you'll probably never even know. Guarantee you there are boats going by right now generating big waves. You're not gonna see those waves. They tend to dissipate. When you have a large enough network, small mistakes will tend to cancel each other out. Small mistakes will tend to cancel each other out. We call this the law of large numbers. If errors are random, they tend to cancel one another out with a big enough network. Also, if these networks, these export production networks, if they are sufficiently isolated from one another. Dr. Beatty and I both use doctors. His doctor gives him bad advice, or Dr. Beatty will be made worse off. It's not going to affect me. My doctor's 2,000 miles away. When these networks are isolated, we won't see cascading failure. We will get expert failure. We will get individual cases of expert failure. But unless there is something systematically broken, unless there's something systematically wrong, the bad advice that Dr. Beatty gets is not going to affect me or anybody else in this room unless you happen to share the same doctor. But if we have a monopoly, we have one supply of expert opinion. That's when things can get tricky. When you have somebody who can dominate, a big player, somebody who can shape opinion simply by existing. Now we can start to have these cascading effects. Just like the big banks in 2008. If one of them goes down, it takes the whole system down. That's what we're talking about here. On the left here, panel A, this is just a diagram of what I was talking about, these isolated experts. In sector 1, there's some expert opinion. It's given, it stays within sector 1. It's not going to bleed on to sector 2 or any of the others. This star diagram, all these sectors are interacting with one another, but they're sufficiently large. No one person dominates the market. Expert opinion will tend to get canceled out. There'll be hopefully sufficiently random errors. But if we have a situation like this, say sector 1 is a monopoly producer of expert opinion. And their opinion is used by multiple markets. Sectors 2, 3, 4, 5, so on and so forth. If there is a mistake made by that expert, that sector 1, it's going to bleed down through all of these others. And if those sectors in turn sponsor their own networks, if those sectors in turn feed other people, then the expert opinion can continue to grow and expand. So with expert failure thus far, a lot of it has been focusing on these individual small cases of expert failure. Some systematic. There is some research that I have just started working on with some others looking at systematic failures in forensic science. But for the most part, expert failure tends to focus on just these individual cases. Now we're going to be looking at, well, what happens when you have a dominant supply? So let's take a look at COVID. Sure, that's burned into memories of everybody in this, unlike the 2008 financial recession. Early on, I want you to throw your memory back to February 2020. Don't know how old many of you were, please don't answer that. But I know for a fact, Dr. Beatty and I were sitting on a subway train going to see the XFL Washington team play. I don't even remember who they were playing.
St. Louis.
St. Louis, that's right. XFL, what a thing. But we had just started seeing cases of COVID-19 popping up in the United States. Now, COVID itself, the underlying virus that is the COVID virus, is not a particularly new virus. Respiratory viruses are quite common in humans. But COVID-19, of course, was novel. We had not seen that particular strand before. And so consequently, there was a debate going on in Washington, D.C., and other capitals at the time. How do we use our scarce resources? How do we use our scarce tests? We only had a handful of tests that could accurately pinpoint COVID-19. How do we allocate those tests to the best use? There was a disagreement amongst experts, epidemiologists whose job it is to study the formation and dissemination of new viruses and new diseases. They wanted to randomly test the population. Not sure how far many of you have gotten in your metrics classes or your statistics classes, but one of the best ways to understand the underlying characteristics of a population is you randomly test. Hopefully you get a nice sample that is representative of the whole population. You test that sample, you see what's going on. But at the same time that the epidemiologists wanted to randomly test to try and get an understanding of the nature of the virus. How does it spread? How deadly is it? How widespread is it already in the population? It's basic information. The CDC and the public health officials, NIH and all of those, they were arguing we need to restrict those tests to hospitals. We need to use those tests to help hospitals determine who is sick so that then they can be isolated, resources can be allocated to hot spots, so on and so forth. And this is February, March of 2020. We did not have that many tests on hand. And for all intents and purposes, in that short time period, the supply curve is perfectly inelastic. You can't just ramp up production of tests overnight. We had limited supply, high demand, effectively no market. It's not like the hospitals could bid against the hospitals could bid against the statisticians. How do we allocate them? Well, ultimately, the public health officials won. They won because they have the power of government behind them. Surprisingly, when you have, the full faith and credit of the federal government, we can do a lot. But in March of 2020, the order came down. These tests are to be used for hospitals only. They're not to be used for randomly testing the population. And consequently, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, the FDA is in charge, I should say, of the medical production, including the production of tests. They kind of became the sole supplier of expert opinion. In other words, they did use the power of government to kind of dominate the conversation. I'm not saying that they deliberately repressed others. That is not always the case. There was some going on, but those are still being legislated by the courts. But rather, they would simply appeal on their authority as regulators. We are the experts here. We are going to order that tests be used just for certain purposes. Consequently, the CDC, in our cascading model here, the CDC, you can think of it as the monopoly supplier of opinion. They gave the orders. That went down to the clinics. Only use your tests for testing people who appear to be COVID related. Which, by the way, if you're in the hospital and you have COVID, you're not looking good. Your outlook is not good for the rest of your life at that point. That order went down to modelers. People like the Imperial College of London, Neil Ferguson, who his job for the British government was to figure out how is this going to spread. You had Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. You had various agencies here in the United States trying to predict the outcome of this diseases, the information that they're using coming from the CDC and all these other sectors. We were using that information. The CDC, and I still see the signs not only around campus, but on my campus too, in Louisiana, everywhere you go, you still see the sign, wash your hands, do this, do that, everywhere you go. And of course, that is good advice. And, anytime you should be washing your hands, don't lick doorknobs, things like that. But the CDC really became a dominant, supplier of expert opinion during this time. Consequently, the decision that they made ended up making things go from bad to worse. The CDC and FDA, the National Institutes of Health, are not, generally speaking, epidemiologists. They do have epidemiologists on staff, but a lot of them are medical doctors. A lot of them are immunologists, meaning they specialize in vaccines and vaccine production, things like that. They were heavily, heavily silent. Many of them using their considerable knowledge, started giving opinions, started giving advice on how to combat flu. Flu outbreaks, we know how to handle extraordinarily well. Humanity has been fighting flu since the day we first crawled from the primordial muck. SARS viruses, which COVID is one, relatively new. But the case book for handling flu is pretty well known. When you're dealing with a novel virus, though, until you really understand what it's like, how it's working, how it spreads, how deadly it is, you don't want to really treat it like it's no big deal. So, not only did some of these experts start giving some unintentionally bad advice that ended up leading to worse outcomes, they also started actively rejecting advice from anybody who they considered not properly vetted as experts. In the early days, April of 2020, May of 2020, when the lockdown orders were coming, March and April, a lot of people were objecting. First off, the epidemiologists were saying, hey, when you have a disease that's spread by people being in close contact with each other, you really don't want to put them in close contact with one another. But you had the economists. The economists were saying, hey, we start locking everything down. You know what's that's going to disrupt? The production of medical supplies, which we desperately need. They started shutting down highways. And the logistics, people who study logistics, they're out there saying, guys, we got a problem here. You shut down the highways, you shut down the rest stops. How are the truckers going to get stuff from the factories to the stores, so on and so forth? And the constant refrain that we heard was, shut up and listen to the expert. Now, I am the expert on economic matters. I got a freaking PhD in the stuff. You throw in price controls. You guys have all been through Econ 101, or at least part of it, I assume. Principles of micro. You throw in price controls, what happens? Thank you. There are shortages. I'm perfectly fine by just staring at people until I get an answer. You get shortages, not enough to go around. Well, in a way to try and keep things like face masks, hand sanitizer, Clorox wipes relatively affordable, the Trump administration in April of 2020 threw price controls on these goods and services. The predictable shortages happened. When economists objected and said, no, we need prices to rise, we need to encourage this more production, we need to import stuff from overseas, the public health officials said, no, this is a public health crisis, we know what we're doing, we don't need the advice of economists. But what ended up happening is, with the predictable shortages, people then had to start going to more stores to find the goods and services they need, the masks, the wipes, hand sanitizer, sometimes even just the food that they need. So you have people now going out more and more, having more and more points of contact. Again, we have a disease that is spread by people being in contact with one another. The advice given ended up causing more contact, more spread of the disease. It had the opposite effect. The lockdowns were designed. That you? Okay, stop it. I will throw you out. the lockdowns, which were designed to control the spread, ended up accidentally encouraging it. And I will argue, although I will admit upfront and on the record, I have relatively little empirical evidence to support that. I suspect the approach that we had is part of the price controls, things like that, likely contributed to making things worse in this country, the spread worse than in some other places. So the public health officials, they looked at the shortages and said, oh, well, that's just because we have high demand, relatively low supply. It has nothing to do with price. Well, the economists were screaming their heads off. No, it is price. No, it is price. Because they did not know how to interpret that information, they did not realize, the public health officials did not realize that their very advice was causing the problem. They were making the problem that they were trying to solve worse. The experts were failing. This wasn't a grand conspiracy. This wasn't Anthony Fauci sitting in Washington, D.C. going, wah, ha, ha, ha. I fully believe that he's a decent human being. Rather, it was an institutional failure. It was an institutional failure. The public health officials dominated the conversation. We had economists and psychologists, educational education people, everybody else who wanted to be part of these conversations, shaping expert opinion. But what I show with the dashed line here, they were blocked or misinterpreted. Thus, the expert opinions given out by the NIH, so on and so forth, filtered down to the various sectors, and we all ended up being affected by it. So then the question becomes, how do we prevent these cascading failures? I just said that it is a institutional failure. There may be bad actors. I mean, we can always come up with various conspiracy theories. But science, the whole point of science is to be an antidote against conspiracies, against superstition. Again, I'm quoting Adam Smith. You'll see me do that a lot. So the question then becomes, how can we structure the incentives? How can we structure the institutions to prevent these sorts of cascades, prevent another failure? Well, a big one comes from research done on the American court system and the European court systems. When you have contesting experts, not one expert who dominates the conversation, but multiple experts who are, for lack of a better phrase, competing with one another, more information becomes revealed. So hopefully not many of you have had experience with our court systems, but here in American courts, the jury is the finder of fact. You get in trouble, you go before a judge, the judge determines law, but the jury ultimately determines whether you are guilty or innocent. And you have two lawyers. One, the prosecutor, his job or her job is to convict you. The other, the defense. The defense's job is to get you off the hook. They will go back and forth, back and forth. The prosecution presents a witness and it questions them. Then the defense comes along and the defense questions the witness. Sometimes the lawyers will talk to one another. They're not supposed to, but it does happen. And through this process, it's called the adversarial court system. Through this process, what we see is, at least in theory, a fuller, clearer picture of the truth emerges. This process is sometimes glorified on shows like Law and Order and other courtroom dramas. It does not always work. Theory is not always perfect, but we do see, lots of studies have shown this, when lawyers are contesting, each one wants to win. So when the opposing side puts out a viewpoint, the other side knows, oh, I'm going to undermine that, or I'm going to make them qualify their point. More information becomes revealed to the jury, the non-expert, who can then make a better decision. The courtroom may seem abstract, but it is widely applicable to many real-world situations. Before graduate school, I was a consultant. My whole job was to fly all over the country, go into into boardrooms, not courtrooms, go into boardrooms and be a sanity check on internal forecasters. Internal sales forecasters, they have certain goals they want to meet. They have an incentive. Oh, if I put the sales, our sales force projections a little low and the salesmen come out ahead, I look brilliant. But consequently, what happens, and this is a real thing that I witnessed, sales projections are low. The company does not allocate that many resources to that region. They end up missing their goals or missing huge projects because the resources aren't there. My job was to come in, question the forecasts made by the internal folks, which were ended up as they were forced to revise their forecasts, they became more accurate. And here's a lesson to you. Let me talk to all the students in the audience for a moment. Here's how you can get more out of your college education through expert failure, through my research. I said earlier, your professors have to make choices. Your professors have to make choices. And they will unintentionally fail you sometimes. There's maybe something you want to learn about that they're going to cut for space reasons or whatever. Ask the question. Ask the question. Hey, Dr. Beatty, I was at my family's house for Easter and my uncle said blah, 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 blah. What do you think about that? Or I was over in the English department and they said this, that, or the other thing. What are your thoughts on this? Make him do his job. Make him do his job. Make him educated. Make that more information become revealed, and do that for your other professors as well. This can be very powerful at getting more information. Be surprised how much talking goes. Furthermore, we don't want experts to be placed on a pedestal. They should not be unassailable. We should have not only experts be able to question one another, but we question experts. When you go to your doctor, and ask them for advice. If you do not understand it, or it sounds weird to you, ask for clarification. I realize that sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people just say, yeah, the doctor told me to take this pill 3 times a day, so that's what I'm going to do. Personal experience, in graduate school, I put on a ton of weight. I'm a stress eater. I went from 180 to 220 pounds in 2 years. 40 pounds, that's a lot. Went to the doctor said, well, you have high blood pressure, you have this, that, the other thing, I want you to start taking these pills. I hate pills. You should see me take pills. It's like watching a duck. Well, it's awful. Hate pills. So I said, well, hold on. I really don't want to take pills. I'm a graduate student making $18,000 a year. Pills are expensive, even with health insurance. There's something else we can do. Well, yeah, you could probably cut out the processed foods, do a little bit more exercise, things like that. And that's what I did. Dropped the weight, got healthier, got the doctor to give me more information simply by pushing back. One of the major issues in COVID is oftentimes we were not allowed, usually by social pressure, not allowed to question. So even when things stopped making sense, the policies still stuck around. Again, same thing with your professors. Asking the questions is not just about clarifying the material, although it is to that, but getting more information. One of the things we find when people question experts, it forces the expert to become more clear, more precise, more accurate with their advice. Everything, there's always hedges. We always have to hedge our bets. Nothing is 100% ever. Get back to the question I said earlier. What happens when you have price controls? Get shortages. Well, that's true, except when price controls are above, when price controls are above the wage or the price, then price controls aren't going to do anything. We have minimum wage in this country, but we don't have millions and millions and millions of unemployed people. The reason why is almost every state pays above federal minimum wage. even in Louisiana, my state, we're not exactly the wealthiest state in the nation. We're actually behind only West Virginia. My hometown, rural Louisiana, or my town, rural Louisiana, regularly pays $17 an hour. They could increase the minimum wage by $10 an hour. We're not going to get that kind of layoffs. In fact, nothing will happen. So the big takeaway from all this question. Yes, the experts have more information, have more knowledge than you. That does not mean they have more power than you. You are the non-expert. Ask the questions. Reject the advice if it doesn't make sense. Get second opinion. For the sake of time, I'm just going to kind of quickly skip over this. There are other research that I'm working on right now, looking at probability theory, Bayesian, econ, things like that. Doing some work on expert failure in forensics. One of the things that we see is once forensic data gets presented in a court, a conviction almost likely, almost instantly follows, or a plea deal follows. But the reality is, forensic science is not as precise as we think it is. Matter of fact, a lot of times it's wrong. And when you have people whose lives are on the line, who could go to prison for 20, 30, or the rest of their life, we want to know. One of the things my co-authors and I are looking at, well, when the defense just asks the prosecution, hey, can we see the lab report? Can we see the lab report? One of the things that happens is as soon as they ask the prosecutor is more likely to cut either a plea deal or drop charges. Prosecutors are not making things up, not accusing anybody of anything of malfeasance, but they do know that the science isn't always as accurate as it's represented on CSI or Law and Order. I'm gonna skip over this. So there's more here. The slides will be available. Dr. B said, I want to leave time for Q&A. But let me end real quick by saying, I did say at the beginning, everything is scarce. That includes time. Time is our scarcest resource. We only have so many years on this planet, and we never do know when the final curtain falls on our performance. So I do want to say thank you for spending just a little of your time with me. Happy to take any questions.
Yeah, I'll let John take, who we call.
And if we want to end here, I'm fine with that too. It's snowing. I got to drive back to Minneapolis. So, happy to answer any questions if anybody has them.
So there's some other applications of expert failure. So we talked about COVID, we talked about testimony in court. What are some other ones?
One of the things that I'm doing right now, I am an advisor for the state of Louisiana Department of Insurance, where we are trying to get insurance reform done. Louisiana has by far the highest insurance anywhere in the country. And one of the things that I am doing is basically acting as a foil to the state experts. The LDI, Louisiana Department of Insurance, has their own experts. My job is basically to come in and interrogate them, question them, make them justify why we have twice the highest insurance rates, the next highest state. Louisiana has hurricanes, sure, but so does Florida. Why are we paying twice their rate? Things like that. So again, it's all about revealing information. Talking with one another goes a long way. Which actually, that's another bit of advice. The best way to learn anything is to teach it. In your study groups, one of you should become the expert. Your job is to teach the rest of the group that particular topic. And those of you whose job is not the expert, grill them. Trust me, you will learn economics. You will learn biology. You will learn whatever you need to once you're on that hot seat.
Good question. Give examples of breaking down silos. Typically, it's so instinctive you having silos. What are the examples you have for that? The silos broken down.
Yeah, so I can give some examples of people. Frederick von Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize in the 1970s, I forget exactly when. He was an economist, but he also dabbled in psychology. He wrote several books. His most famous is Sensory Order, where he ended up contributing in a major way, not only to economics, but also to psychology. Introducing some economic ideas into psychology, he revolutionized that field, and introducing psychology into economic ideas, he revolutionized that field. Probably should have won 2 Nobel Prizes. Sticking within our own field, Ronald Coase, who won the Nobel Prize in 1980 something, he was a lawyer. He had exactly 0 econ class, but he revolutionized the field. Once you become more open to other ideas, and this is my plug for gen ed classes, especially in the English department, read literature. Read literature. You will see these same ideas come up over and over and over again. Use them to inform your thinking. Break down those silos. And again, you need specialization. You're going to hit the job market in a few years. You're going to have that shiny degree. Your employer, if you're too general, your employer or a future employer isn't going to know what to do with you. You do want to specialize. But don't think economics, business, whatever your major is, dominates your entire worldview. My background is law and economics. I do a lot of philosophy. I wanted to go into seminary and be a priest until I literally flipped a coin to decide between the priesthood and graduate school. It came up heads, so here we are. Figured no clear sign could come from God. But read lots of things. I love to read. Or watch TV. Explore other cultures. Explore other music. You never know where insights are going to come from. You know where the idea for this paper came from? It came from a conversation over coffee one morning after reading Jane Austen. Now, I don't know what it was Jane Austen. I was with a bunch of friends. That's where the conversation was going. I wasn't just sitting there talking to myself. I can't point to you what Jane Austen did to inspire this, but what I can do is something in her book, Northanger Abbey, got me going. I don't know what it was. You never know where inspiration is going to come from. And sometimes it will just smack you on the side of the head.
To your point, I also want to point out, John won the Eleanor Ostrom Prize, and Eleanor Ostrom was the first woman to get a Nobel Prize in econ. She didn't have an econ degree. I think it was like public administration.
Public administration, and that's only because she could not get into an econ program because it was highly sexist anyway.
So another good example of silo breaking down.
You have a question?
Yeah, John, I just wanted to talk about the breaking down the silos. I mean, you were suggesting like you have to have that open mind, like that means you're also talking about those cognitive biases, anchoring bias, all this, that behavioral aspect, economics aspect. So this is also one way, like to have that, get out of those biases. What is the way to do it? Try to expand that network, right? Try to, sometimes people struggle a lot on this, right? How to expand, but of course it's better to listen, as you said, like listen to other people's opinion or what is going on in other fields, and maybe just I don't know, whether joining a different kind of group just to understand, and would you support that kind of thing, or that?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I am, despite what one of our professors in grad school, Brian Kaplan, says, I am staunchly opposed to creating bubbles. And I mean, you want to be selective in your friend list, but you don't want to be so selective that you close off everything and you think, oh, just my view is the only right one. You also don't want to be so open-minded that you have no personality.
Right.
It's okay to have opinions, but engage in other ideas. I'm a ferocious blogger and op-ed writer and things like that. Engage with other people. Again, you never know where the inspiration is going to come from. And again, that contesting experts, you really sharpen your opinion once you have to address people who disagree with you. And sometimes that disagreement can be legitimate. My own opinions have shifted over the years through disagreements I've had with authors in the journals. Anything else?
Well, I will kick off from class. John will stick around for a little bit too to take questions one-on-one too. So let's give him another round of applause.
Everyone.
that. I think you can just end it.